My name is Jay O'Connell. My region is the Maumee Valley region in Ohio. And the car we have here today is a 1988 Porsche 911.
As much as I love driving the Porsche, I usually take the Mazda, and I also review a lot of cars every year. Now, the Porsche has the Escort Redline Max 360C with the M2 Smart Dash Cam set up in it already. I don't like swapping it between cars because I have to realign that whole package. So fortunately, the sponsor of this video, Escort Radar, has sent us the Escort Max 4, which has become my go-to radar and laser detector for swapping in between cars. So it's easy as setting up your suction connector here, which is magnetic, it'll hold real well, and then attaching the power cord just like on any other radar detector. And then after a second, it turns on. The M2 Smart Dash Cam can also be paired with the Max 4 radar detector.
Caution, speed camera ahead.
Protect your drive. Visit escortradar.com today.
Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications by clicking on the bell icon and never miss a video. We've got lots of Porsche content coming your way.
I have a long history working in automotive, but I graduated from Cornell, mechanical engineer, having done 3 years of Formula SAE cars. So that's where I really learned how to weld and machine and package, and really got a strong interest in race cars and automotive engineering. And then from there, I started working at Ford Motor Company, and I was there 18 years, working in a variety of roles in product development. Can you take over the IndyCar program manager role? And even ended up working in Formula One for a year in 2001 at Jaguar Racing. I worked on the new 2005 Mustang, a chief engineer at SVT in 2005 and 6, working on the Shelby GT500 as well as the Ford GT. And then in late 2006, Bobby Rahal called me. We're gonna go sports car racing at Rahal Letterman. Can you come down and join us? I said, sure, great. I moved down to Columbus in late 2006, both on the IndyCar side and the sports car side. Well, since 2016, I've been working as a contract race engineer, first with Multimatic on the Ford GTLM program, attending IMSA races and the Le Mans race in 17, 18, and 19. And that was a lot of fun to apply my experience to the Ford GTLM after having been chief engineer on the 2005 Ford GT, which we wanted to race, and Ford wasn't interested in racing at that time. So that was a lot of fun working on the GTLM. That ended in 2019. So then I continued working on Ford projects for the Mustang GT4 in through 21. And then Will Turner asked me if I could help him with his program, racing in IMSA GTD. So I've been engineering for Will since 2021 and continue today engineering cars in both the SRO series and the IMSA series. And we're really excited this year to have won the Pro-Am Championship in SRO and finished second in the IMSA GTD Championship this year. So a very good season for us. Just a lot of great opportunities and a lot of great experiences all coming together, which have led us to a project like this. Originally the car was a narrow body 88, and in a previous life someone had added steel flares, making it a wide body. What's special about it is that we've combined modern 991 Cup suspension with the 1988 architecture. Well, the original suspension on these cars is basically carried over all the way from 1964 when it was introduced. And I have a 1970 911, so I'm very familiar with the original semi-trailing arm style suspension. Because of my time at the racetrack as a race engineer, I realized that the Cup 991 911s have a unique rear upright and side frame from the regular street 991s. And those unique parts allow them to fit 18-inch wheels, which by regulation they have to use in racing. So I started to realize that there's a possibility of fitting these 991 Cup modern race car parts into the underbody of an 88 911, which had never been done before. Well, I met the owner through a mutual friend, Gavin Ritchie's, and he's since passed, but he was the owner of
AutoQuest in Fort Myers. It was basically they were caring for, they brought in the Club Sport for me. They're caring for the car. I was getting ready, was very excited about driving Sebring, and Gavin said, hey, you know, you need to know about this multi-link rear suspension kit for the Cayman that my friend Jay put together. I said, well, who's Jay? And they learned about Jay. I said, that sounds cool. Well, what are the benefits? So I actually just said, yeah, go ahead, put it on.
That was very successful, a lot of fun there. And then we were thinking about what other projects could we work on, and we kind of migrated to this air-cooled 911.
But I wanted to segue into something that was more, shall we say, manual, more analog, and learn how to drive better ultimately. You know, I've been using PDK for a long time, and so it's great to come back to stick shift, and the goal is to get those driving dynamics of the modern Porsche with all the wonderful things we like about the air-cooled cars.
And then I said, well, you know, I've had an air-cooled 911 for a long time, and they're fun to drive, but, you know, why don't we try and modernize it? And the owner said, well, you know, I've had a 991 GT3, how could we make the air-cooled car drive and handle like the GT3? And I said, well, that's going to be a little bit of a challenge because, you know, that's fast-forwarding almost 40 years. Well, this car, the owner drove it up from Florida in December 2019. And then I really started working on it in February of 2020. So you could say it was a pandemic car because, you know, 2020 we had a lot of free time away from the racetrack. Fortunately, we got it together enough to take it to Rensport 7 in late September, early October of 2023. And
one of the things we did at Rensport is we put the car up on stands and kind of tilted it over and put mirrors underneath it, just kind of like what the lowriders do at the SEMA show. Except we did it with, so you wanted to see what's going on underneath.
Well, with my background in product development at Ford, it's a slightly different challenge than developing a race car where you're just trying to go as fast as possible with the lowest lap time. So in product development, it's really more about what's the car like to drive at a third of a G, at a half a G, you know, normal roads, you know, at speeds that are not going to get you arrested. And so in developing those cars, I found that the steering feel is the most important aspect. When you ask someone how the car handles, they tell you how it steers, because they're not handling it the limit, because they can't really do that, but they're telling you how does the car respond to the steering. And so I realized over time that the steering feel is really the personality of the car. And if you've got stability and precision, then when you add the agility, the car really starts to be fun to drive. It starts to become athletic. So my challenge and my goal was to make this car achieve all those parameters, and using the modern parts allowed us to do that because you've got more stability with the 991, more precision with the modern parts, and then tuning the front and rear suspension to make it more agile. You know, we've talked a lot about the rear suspension from the 991. The front suspension is equally exciting because we used a double A-arm suspension, and we used the damper mounted to the upright, which allowed us to fine-tune its position and get more agility in the car without sacrificing precision or stability. So just taking all of my experience and applying it to this car has really been fun on the development side.
It's kind of a sleeper because it looks like it's RS style, air-cooled, but underneath is where all the tricks are. It's what we call an engineer's car.
All right, so let's take a look at the parts underneath the car now that we know a little bit of the backstory. This car is really built around the 991 Cup upright and side frame. And the reason we're using those is those are the only uprights and side frames that fit inside an 18-inch wheel. And Porsche was really smart in designing this part for the street cars using 19s and 20s, and then moving all these points a little bit closer to the center so you can fit an 18-inch wheel over them on the racetrack, and in our case, on this car. So by using those castings was a good start. The trick was, how do we get this side frame integrated into the old rail structure of the G Series 911? So I started by offering the frame up to the side frame up to the car and figuring out where this point could be. And it's kind of limited by how far forward you can go before you get into the knee of the rail. And you see right here, it's tight right up against the knee there, and I cut away the flange and reinforced it and cut down the side frame just ever so slightly to be able to get the side frame as far forward in the car so that we could get the link angles very similar. it's still not quite as far forward as it would be in a 991 Cup car. So all the links are angled just slightly forward. And as you might see over here, the side frame on this side, I had to cut a hole out to clear the spark plug because it's just right into that spark plug. And that just shows you how close the side frame is to the case as compared to what it would be on a 991 Cup or a 991 street car. So once I had those established, I centered up the side frames until this structure I added was right through the center of the rails because I want the most strength between what I've added and what was already there. And so after that point, then there's 3 additional attachment points where the side frame hooks into the rail. And of course, the trick is to try and make an old 911 rail look like a 991. And so that meant, of course, adding this point we talked about, and another point just forward of that right here. Here, I'll use the flashlight and that'll help you. So there's that point there. And then there's a third point way up here, which is unique. That point there is only on the Cup race cars, not on the road car. So a regular 991 GT3 won't have that attachment. And then the last point right here. And so these are the 991 factory studs and nuts, all the hardware, but bolted into structure that I welded into the underbody to hold it in position. Then going even further forward, there's another attachment point, this bracket here with 3 legs that go into the rail and into the rear seat area. That holds the front mounting point, the front suspension point, and the anti-roll bar in order to secure that. So all in all, we're talking about 7 attachment points added on each side of the car to pick up this modern architecture from the 991 Cup. Of course, the suspension itself is multi-link and it's 5-link, and a lot of people wonder, well, why is it 5? And that's because every wheel and tire, like any object, has 3 degrees of freedom, X, Y, and Z, and 3 degrees of rotation around the 3 axes, so 6 degrees of freedom. So by having 5 links or 5 constraints, that leaves 1 degree of freedom, which is going to be the toe and camber curve, the path of travel that we want the wheel to follow. So, which is then controlled by the spring and shock. But that's why we have 5 links and 5 constraints on every suspension. So you have 1 degree of freedom left. Kind of a nice little side note. In addition to the links, we have the sway bars from the GT3. So this is a 991 GT3 sway bar and drop links with the 3 adjustment points here. We've got it in the middle position right now. We could go a little stiffer or softer depending on what we need for the type of event we're running. So one of the things you'll notice though is to get the upright to connect to the shock took a little bit of trickery, because the shocks on a G Series 911, these are coilover now. We've eliminated the torsion bars and the trailing arms, but the shocks are inboard quite a bit from where they are on a 991. So that means that I couldn't move the shock out and connect it to the upright directly where it would be on a 991 because the shock is inboard. So I came up with this bracket that bolts into the upright, extending the upright to the shock, and then using this tension link up here to support the torque created. In any event, it just becomes an extension of the upright to be able to adapt this brand new 2023 upright to a 1988 shock and coilover. But it was a good challenge and a lot of fun, and as a result now we've got a camber curve that is aggressive and a toe curve that's nice and straight, both of which are giving us good wheel control out on the road. But a couple other points to make. I didn't exactly use the side frame as stock. I raised the rear lateral point up 15 millimeters from, there's the stock point, there's my point. And the same thing on this front mount, I raised up the attachment point. And that's because I'm trying to get the roll center height, or where all these points work together, trying to get it up a little higher with the tires that are shorter. These tires are a lot shorter than what would be on a 991 Cup race car or on a street car. So to get the link angles correct, get the roll center at the right height, required modifying the parts. And then to connect the 2 side frames together, we made this cross member, affectionately called Goldmember. And it's custom, of course, because the side frames are a different span than they are in a 991. But this cross member hooks into the lower lateral links and into the frame and takes the lateral load from one side back into the other. It also hooks into these GT3 lower diagonal braces that tie into the chassis, and a nice little plate to triangulate it. So these are all out of the GT3 as well. All told, we're adding structure between the side frames, the cross member, these braces. We're adding about 40 pounds of structure to the car that wasn't there. And of course, nobody wants more weight, but this weight is giving so much more lateral stiffness and control of the wheels that it's well worthwhile. If you're interested, the suspension is about the same weight as what was on a 1988 stock vehicle. You know, considering the uprights, control arms, and the anti-roll bar, etc. What's different is the brakes. The brakes are heavier because they're so much larger. I mean, considering the brakes, I think there were only 230 or 40 millimeter diameter on an 88 Carrera. These are 350 millimeters. And you're going to say, well, why didn't you make them smaller? Well, I struggled to get them this size on there because this upright is made for a brake disc no smaller than 380. And so the challenge was to get these brake discs in the Fuchs wheels, I had to shrink them down. So this brake disc is actually a 350 by 28 from the 997 GT3 RS 4.0. So aluminum center, iron ring, but it was kind of one of the last 911s that had a 350 rear disc. So that's the disc, and then the caliper is from a 991S because it fits on this 991 upright. The trick was I had to machine down the caliper and the upright to get the caliper to move in 15 millimeters radially to take it from 380 down to 350. So, but with that in mind, then I was able to get the Fuchs Velga 18 by 10 inch wheel over it. So, before we leave the rear, of course, we don't want to forget the engine. It was a 3.2 liter stock 911, about 200 horsepower, I think, back then. And it's been taken apart and rebuilt, and the bore was increased 3 millimeters to make it a 3.4. We went and had Hoffman did the cylinder heads and increased the valve diameter by 1 millimeter on intake and exhaust, put twin plug machining into it, so you can see the lower spark plugs here, in addition to the regular plugs above. And then we used a camshaft from Doherty. It's a 964, kind of a little bit of a hot rod 964 cam, but not too crazy. So we end up with just a kind of a very solid, torquey 3.4 liter engine, 10.7 to 1 with JE pistons from LN Engineering. And then we've got a 993 distributor to drive the twin plug system. So, but the engine is really just trying to, you know, be a nice upgrade, obviously rebuilding it and modernizing it. It required a unique exhaust system from M&K that looks a lot like what's on a 997 or 991 because the exhaust can't go forward into the normal position because of the structure and cross member and suspension. So it just hooks around back, collects through two little tiny cats, and then into an early style sport muffler with the outlets, you know, closer together. Okay, another detail we did on this car is to incorporate the option of having forced air over the exhaust for the heat. Because obviously it's an air-cooled car, no water cooling. So these two holes here are for the air system that would be off the headers, and then it would go up into the ducts here. There's one on the right side, you know, with the lever adjustment, and there's one on the other side, and so the tubes would go through here and up there, and you'd connect a heat exchanger or heater boxes over the exhaust to have heat. So we wanted to have that option since there's no other heat source. Those of you that know the air-cooled cars and the G-Series cars, of course, will see the torsion bar cover here, and it's empty because there's no torsion bar, there's no trailing arm. All of that is really unused because we now have coilover, and there's no way to drive it with the 991 parts. But it's just kind of funny to see the mounting there for the swing plate and the torsion bar still in place. One detail we kind of skipped over, though, is where the loads, you know, the acceleration and braking loads come through this link and they go through this bracket, and then from this bracket I've tied the structure from here into the torsion bar housing right here with this tube. And so you've got a nice line of force from the suspension all the way into the car, you know, driving it forward or pulling it back depending on if you're accelerating or braking. So just trying to integrate the structure, because the underbody of this car is not a 991, and we've tried to make it as close to a 991 as possible. I mean, just imagine the engineers in the 80s from Porsche, they couldn't have seen what they were going to develop, you know, 35 years later. So it's just really fun to be able to take the newest Porsche parts and get them onto an older car. So let's move on to the front suspension. Since we had upgraded the rear so much, the challenge was what can we do to the front to complement the rear suspension? So here we've upgraded from the conventional McPherson strut to a double A-arm design. So the lower A-arm looks a lot like what was there before. Of course, I made my own bracket here to pick up a rod end link because we're no longer using the torsion bar A-arm. And then this lateral arm here is from the GT4, GT3, GT2, and also the Cup cars. And the key feature here is that it's in double shear. So this bolt going through the upright is grabbing the lower ball joint in double shear. In other words, both sides of it are captured, a lot like all the joints in the rear suspension. And so that required, to pull all that off, required a custom upright. So I designed this upright out of aluminum. It's relatively simple machining, but it picks up the lower ball joint, picks up the steering arm, of course the caliper, but it also picks up the damper, which is no longer a strut. It's it's just a 2 inline force member, but it's mounted through a spherical joint here so that when you steer, it pivots on that joint. And the load is going directly into the upright instead of into the lower arms, because these lower arms aren't designed to handle that load because they're for a strut car. And then at the top of the upright, we've got a joint here to pick up, a coupling to pick up the upper ball joint. And there's shims between this joint and the upright so we can change camber quickly. We can change it down here and we can change it up there. And if you're really smart, you change them both at the same time so you change camber without changing toe because the tie rod's in the middle. So with the upper arm added in place of the strut, that required the tie rod to get a little bit shorter. And that's in order to get the bump steer correct. The tie rods are quite long on the strut car for good reason because of the layout of the strut. And now with double A-arm, the tie rod, so this point here, this inner tie rod is about 3 inches outboard of where it would normally be on the 88. So I made extensions that bolt into the rack. They're solidly mounted and then give you this pivot point and give you the right tie rod length because it's important to have good toe curve in the front suspension as well as in the back. A lot of people will wonder, well, how did you just bolt the upper arm onto the car? And it's interesting because I spent a lot of time looking at the structure and figuring out where the best place would be to put these brackets. There's the rear upper arm point and the front upper arm point, and you can see it here. And those are steel welded brackets that are then riveted to the chassis, the 1/4-inch rivets. Each rivet pulls out at 700 pounds, so we've got plenty of load capacity. And if you notice here, there's kind of a raised section in the chassis here, which I've landed on for this point. I think that was an early feature back in the 60s cars that was no longer used, some kind of vent for fuel or something. But that is right behind where the structure is that's extended for the impact bumpers. So as we can look later on the inside, I added a bracket and structure behind those rivets to tie the load into the existing structure so there's a good load path for the upper arm. Of course, the upper arm isn't loaded that much because it's farther from the contact patch than the lower, but I still tied that load into the car. And then as we get around to the front here, this lower arm, which you might recognize the RSS spherical joint, I've mounted it in double shear as well with this extra bracket that ties into the crossmember. So it's not just in simple bending, trying to get double shear in all the attachments. You can see that in this point, and of course the lower ball joint we talked about, and the forward leading link here and both ends of it, everything in double shear. It's just the proper way to load all the joints to minimize bending, minimize compliance, and get a good result. The last part of the front suspension is the anti-roll bar. These cars normally had a chassis mounted anti-roll bar that went right through this area and hooked onto the lower arms. Well, that wasn't going to work out with these GT2 and 3 parts. Not having a drop link on the stock suspension isn't really ideal. So going with a through body anti-roll bar, and this one's from Tarrant, all the cars can be modified for through body anti-roll bar. So I did that and put the reinforcement plate on there. And then now we've got a nice proper drop link connecting the anti-roll bar down to the lower arm. And yes, that's a little bit of vertical load on the lower arm, but with this H-beam section, there's more than enough strength for the arm to take that. Although it can't take the full spring load, it can certainly take the anti-roll bar load. But that solved all of our packaging problems in the front and allowed us to get the double A-arms installed in this car. We use the stock front crossmember that mounts the steering rack and ties it into the frame, but we moved the attachment points down about 15 millimeters just like we did the front, in order to get the angle of the lower arms correct. And that's all about making sure that the front roll center is lower than the rear roll center. And you're going to say, well, why do you want the rear roll center higher? Well, the rear tire is always one wheelbase of time behind the front. So it's always kind of lagging behind. You make a steering input with the front tire, and the rear tire doesn't know that it's trying to turn yet. So by making the rear roll center higher than the front, the rear tire gets loaded more quickly when it starts to get some load into it, and that catches it up a little bit, reducing the perceived time lag between the front axle and the rear axle. So it's just something I've learned in racing. It's really important to have the front roll center lower than the rear roll center. And you can argue about whether they're above ground or below ground, but no matter what, the roll axis from the rear to the front needs to be tipped down towards the front. I tried to work on cars where it was the other way, and we could just never get them to steer and handle correctly. And as soon as we raised the rear roll center, then everything was good again. So I've applied that to this car. We've got the front roll center lower than the rear roll center. So we're moving these front inner points down and the rear inner points up, and that's effectively inclining the roll axis like we're talking about. With one more detail to talk about in the front suspension, which is easy to miss. I mentioned that the shock and spring, the coilover is mounted to the upright, which, okay, many of you may not be familiar with that, but we did this in IndyCar in the late 90s. Reynard was doing it specifically for Long Beach in order to get more weight jacking with steer. And the way they do that is that you mount the shock rearward of the axis between the upper and lower ball joints. By mounting it rearward, then you get more oversteer when you steer, and if you moved it forward, you get understeer. Well, so I've moved it 10 millimeters rearward of the axis, and that gives us a nice weight jacking effect, which helps reduce understeer at lower speeds. And so you can feel that out on the road as it's more agile, because as you steer, you get more loading on the outside rear tire, and it makes the car turn, and it just makes it more agile. Fortunately, with a rear suspension that's very stable, we're not going to get into an oversteer situation. We're just going to get some nice neutrality as we're steering in those medium speed corners. So it's a detail that was used in IndyCar in the 90s, and it's still a feature used in Formula One cars today. Of course, they have push rods, but the push rods are mounted on the upright on most Formula One cars, and in order to reduce low speed understeer, because they have such a long wheelbase and they really don't want to turn. So here we don't have a long wheelbase, but we still want it to be as agile as reasonable. So we're using a little bit of that offset to get some weight jacking with steer. The front brakes are Giro disc 350 millimeters, obviously 32 millimeters wide, a little bit wider than the rear because you're doing so much more brake work on the front. The calipers are early 996 turbo, 4-piston calipers, so more Porsche family parts. Again, 350 is the biggest I could fit inside the 18 by 8 Fuchsfelge forged wheels. So, but it seemed to complement the rear. Since I couldn't make the rear any smaller, I needed to make the front at least the same size as the rear in order to have a reasonable distribution of braking force. And so to make these larger calipers, the pistons are much larger than what was in the stock vehicle. I had to use a 911 turbo master cylinder because it had bigger calipers, if you recall, back in the 80s. So that was a great part to get and just substitute. And then the hydraulic balance is correct, and the brake pedal efforts are correct. And as you will see on the road, the brake feel is reasonable. So that kind of summarizes the front suspension. Right at the front of the car, we've added an oil cooler that lines up with the 74 RS bodywork. And that oil cooler is in series with the original oil cooler that's in the right front fender. So we've got 2 oil coolers, which should be more than enough for track use, and gives us the possibility of adding more horsepower later without having to redo the cooling system. So the original cooler with a fan, and then the front cooler, the oil's going through both and then back to the engine. We've got some great hilly roads around here in southeast and southwest Ohio.
Yeah, it's been beautiful, and it's middle of October, late October actually.
It's beautiful.
And we had to take our jackets off, so. Yeah, and there's that lightweight flywheel that you were telling me about. It's funny, a lightweight flywheel in these, much harder to modulate than in a 987 Cayman.
Yep.
That's for sure. Yeah, very nice shift throw. Yeah, so you kept the G50, and to expand on this, you have the longer throw, but with a short shifter, so the throw ends up being
Yeah, trying to keep the travel the same, but move the shift knob a lot closer to the wheel, more like a modern car,
Yeah.
more like a 987 or 981 or 991.
Yeah, just cruising around, really civil. The engine super smooth. You know, at these speeds, it feels like, you know, for a 3.2 motor in that sense, a little bit louder. Has a pretty trick exhaust to make that rear suspension work. Didn't get that heel toe or rev match right, but we'll try that again. Put that blinker on.
Yep.
Oh yeah,
Nice little bank
it
corner.
revs so nice and fast.
Yeah.
And the steering is yeah, this is not a power steering modern 911, so it has the suspension that's modern, but you still got to muscle it.
Still manual steering, because manual steering, you know, a feature of these cars, and it gives you great feel for the road from the front tires.
Yeah. Yeah, very composed. I want to say less movement, and just the bumps are like, I don't know, it feels smoother, despite being stiffer.
Well, it's about the same.
The ride is about as harsh as a stock car, even though it's a stiffer setup.
It's patterned after the Cayman R as far as stiffness. So not a full GT car, but definitely stiffer than stock.
Gotcha.
Yeah. We just don't have the cones up for your autocross, right?
Oh, here we go, huh? Am I good?
Good, yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's very nice. Yeah, it's like stock plus. It's not like the difference between a 996 Carrera and a 996 GT3, the way the engine is. But it's like, there's more to it.
Yeah. Yeah, these are 964 hot rod cams in a 3.4. So.
Yeah. Slightly larger. Yeah, and you can heel toe nice and easy. What's really nice is the harder you get on the brakes, it responds to pressure, but it doesn't sink much lower, so you can maintain your pedal or foot placement on the pedals.
Yep. And you notice the car doesn't pitch that much.
Yeah, no, it's very flat. So what do you do to get that?
Well, by utilizing the 991 multi-link, we've got a nice amount of anti-lift in the rear, which means when you brake, it doesn't lift up. And then we've got a little bit of anti-dive that we put in the front suspension with the AA arms.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're controlling pitch at both ends under braking.
Yeah.
Of course, a little bit stiffer springs help.
Yeah.
Because this is still a short wheelbase 911.
Yeah. So that, when I was on as soon as you start turning, is when this car feels amazing.
Yeah.
It's a little disconcerting in a straight line because it is pretty reactive.
Yeah.
But yeah, once you're like in that bend.
So one of the things we've been playing with is the front toe.
Yeah.
And it's got just 10 minutes front toe out, which makes it a little reactive on center, but great entering the corner.
Yeah.
Whereas if we go 10 minutes toe in, it'll have a tighter center, but you'll have to overcome that to get in the corner.
Yeah, so, it's nice in the corners.
Yeah.
Wow. And you know what's funny? I haven't even mentioned the rear suspension yet. And that might be the best compliment, actually.
Yeah.
Is that it's sort of just...
It just trails along,
right?
It doesn't stick out.
You're not thinking about it.
You don't have to worry about drop throttle oversteer or any of those silly things, right?
Yeah. It wants to turn.
Doesn't it? Yeah. It's kind of like a mid-engine car that way. You think turn and it turns.
Yeah.
But the engine's still at the back.
Yeah.
So credit to Porsche for coming up with this geometry to make the rear work so well.
Yeah. You know what I feel like this car wants me to do, but not today?
Drifting around,
is to load up the front more and harder.
Oh, yeah. Eventually, eventually it'll understeer.
That was awesome.
So
that felt nice.
I could feel you were starting to slide the front a little bit.
Yeah. I knew was happening. I'll pull it back a little bit.
No, it's okay, but it's telling you, okay, you're starting to slide the front tire.
And I know it. Okay. I just kept going actually because I knew if I kept my foot where it was, I would track out to where I wanted to be. But really predictable.
But there's still some grip there. You could increase angle and get a little more turn if you wanted it.
Yeah. In second, cool.
Second gear's good through here. Yeah.
Wow.
Nice corner, nice corner. Yeah, that was
That
fun.
felt good. I was
Yeah.
on the brakes a little bit deeper than
And you loaded
some of the others.
So you loaded the front tire, and then it gave you more
yeah,
grip.
Yeah.
Yep.
This car comes together better when you do that.
Yep.
So I've got a feeling, you know, this drive today is giving me like a taste, but
Yeah.
it's one of those like,
Get me on track, right?
yeah, easy to drive, hard to master sort of thing,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
I'm getting a taste of it.
But you've driven a lot of air-cooled 911s
Yeah.
of different vintages, so
Yeah.
you know, how does this fit in with your other experiences?
I would say that the suspension right here.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. I would say the suspension feels probably better than any of them that I've driven, in the sense that it doesn't feel old.
Yeah.
It
yeah.
feels like up and wants to go.
right.
The engine's great, but I have driven, let's say,
Well, there's
Carrera
so-
Cup USA has had a
For sure.
similarly great engine.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that the engine is the standout part for me. It's really,
For sure, yeah.
it's really about the steering. The
Yeah.
steering is different. Yeah, the front end and the steering, it's sharper. It likes to load up like a classic, you know,
Yeah.
regularly set up air cooled. And I haven't thought about, maybe I haven't taken any, I know there hasn't been a turn where I've been able to, or thought about playing with the rear end weight balance.
Right.
But I'm wondering if that's also, I just haven't noticed because the rear end doesn't
It doesn't
do
any-
as much.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything untoward. It just
So
follows
yeah,
along.
I think your comment about it feeling mid-engine in that respect,
Yeah.
and my earlier comment about a GT car, when my first time in a GT 997 GT3 RS versus
Yeah.
a Carrera, is that the car didn't feel rear engine
Right,
compared to the Carrera.
Right,
And
yeah.
that's what this feels like.
Yeah.
So it's subtle differences, and like if you're looking for that rear engine feeling at slow speeds, this might not be the car for you
Right.
in that sense, because it is locked down. But I'm guessing, you know, physics are physics, so at the track, you know, that
Yeah.
rear engine's
Eventually,
gonna come into
the
play.
engine's going to lead.
Yeah, yeah. Just much quicker speeds.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Nobody behind you, so try a good hard brake here, and then
Cool.
we'll get right back up to it.
Sounds good, will
Yeah.
do. All right, in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that's hard. I'm gonna try again without doing any shifts.
Yeah. You can really get a feel for the brake power in this car.
Yeah,
The brakes are so much bigger than
Yeah.
they were originally.
yeah. All right, 3, 2, 1.
Awesome.
Wow.
Yeah. Very little pitch.
Dang.
No ABS either. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just hydraulics and torque and brakes working for you.
Yeah. So I wasn't thinking that this car didn't have ABS when I did that.
Yeah, you went for it. Yeah.
Yet there was still more left in it.
Yeah, still
so-
more. Yeah, you didn't lock a front tire.
No.
You will eventually lock the
Yeah,
front, but
yeah.
and-
Let's not try that today.
no, but I mean, you're braking at almost 1G there.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
I mean, Powersport Cup 2 tires are helping you.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the
Right
best
turn.
tires ever fitted to
Yeah.
a street legal
fantastic.
car, I think.
Yeah, fantastic.
Unless it's the Cup 2R, if that's
well, yeah,
if that's
those
your,
tires aren't
style.
very good below 50 degrees though.
Yeah.
Right turn here, second gear.
Yeah.
I'll call them out rally style for
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Just such a great corner.
Yeah.
Both ends sliding a little, or just the front?
That one just the front.
Yeah.
When I came up, I could take that corner faster, but
course,
it's really tough for me
Yeah.
to get there to do it.
Yeah.
So
You can load it up here. Yeah. Nice.
flows so well.
Yeah, it's not floating over that hill. It's just
Yeah.
following the road, and
Yeah.
but it doesn't, it doesn't feel like it's got too much rebound. But
Yeah.
second gear. Oh, look, you
Yep.
got the rear to slide just
Yeah,
a
a little bit.
Look at that. He's
Yeah.
getting there.
Yep.
The engine finally presents itself.
Yep. So there's the power to do that.
Yep.
Yep. It'll understeer, oversteer depending on what input you give it, what
Well,
you tell it to do. So
Yeah, you can decide with your feet
Yep.
and your hands how to do it.
Yep. Yeah, and it definitely has enough power to do that.
he wanted her to rev it up. That's funny. You all right?
Yeah. Don't force it. Slow down if that ever happens, right? Wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the front rear arrow's starting to come in a little bit.
Yeah.
But the whale tail is making it stable.
Yeah.
And the front bumper keeping it okay. But
Yep.
I think it needs a little bit less front lift myself. But
Yeah.
we'll work on that when we take it to the track. But I'm glad you got to try the brakes the last time around to see the
Yeah.
pitch control.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm getting the hang of it.
Good.
I'm getting the hang of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably say
Porsche.
that this car, yeah. It definitely isn't like a beginner's car. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In a sense, I don't think somebody who's like brand new to Porsche, it's a little bit intimidating actually.
Right turn, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. And yeah, now I think I'm in tune with the car enough that I felt
Right.
when I did that, I felt, you know, I was telling you about my stomp in the Cayman.
Yep,
In
yep.
a sense, to get that little wiggle, and I
Yep.
think I felt that.
Yeah, you're using the power to continue the rotation.
Yeah.
Get a little more
Yeah.
slip angle out of the rear tire and
Yeah.
and get just a hint of oversteer.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a wonderful car to drive. Why is it called GoldenRod?
The car's called GoldenRod. It's part of a play on my last name, but it was coined. We like Austin Powers and some of that kind of funny, silly stuff. And you know, we want to give the message of it's a fun car. And our good friend Frank Yates, who is a master tech at AutoQuest Motorsports, actually came up with the idea. You know, this whole thing is really actually very creative. There's a high degree of engineering, but it's a very creative project. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done. They'd look at it. Jay takes a tape measure, looks at it a couple different angles and said, I think we can do it. Yeah, we're real pleased with it and we can't wait to share it. And I like having other people drive it. I like getting feedback and people experiencing it. So that's what we're looking forward to. Definitely not going to be a garage queen.